What would I do without her?
What would you do without her? Well,
all this state-of-the-art fly to the moon stuff.
that's right. Well, how have you been, Ron?
Oh, fine.
Good.
Don't show that to the viewers.
Already did.
I'm really a chicken down under. The real self chicken.
Well, how have you been, Ron? We haven't spoken for a while.
Oh, fine. In the busy, really the throes of mid-semester. So the horse is at a bit of a gallop, and I'm holding the reins with feet in the stirrups. And
what classes are you teaching this semester?
so this semester, I'm doing an upper level human rights theory and practice. The second level intellectual, Western intellectual tradition from Erasmus to Friedrich Nietzsche. An ideology and politics course, and then running sort of a bit of a covert seminary at the public university. So I'm doing a bunch of students who want to do Augustine City of God.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so we've been working through 2 books a week. We just had books 11 and 12 of the City of God. And so they're quite loving it, grounding them in, well, obviously a great thinker, and then reflecting on what has he contributed of good, and then critical reflections on Augustine as a thinker and his impact on Luther and Calvin, and where they perhaps have misread him, and where perhaps Augustine's misread Paul and Romans and Galatians. And so it's a sort of a nice approach to a great thinker.
Yeah. City of God, what an important work for our history.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just last week I had a conversation with Brett Sockold, who published, I think we've got the book right here. Really a terrific book. He's a diocese theologian in for the Roman Catholics in Regina, Saskatchewan. Just wrote this book, Transubstantiation. Really a fine book, basically treating Luther's misunderstanding of Aquinas, dealing with real presence. We had a terrific conversation, and it was really a good book. So, so much.
Oh, good. I'll have to take a read of it then. Good advice then.
Yeah, take a look at it. I found it terrifically helpful. Someone in fact in my church saw the conversation and was all excited about healing the wounds of the Protestant Reformation, and then he went to Sola Scriptura. I thought, well, we make progress in one front and then the other side falls apart. So a lot of reasons for division. But our topic today is this. How much time do you have, by the way?
Oh, well, whatever works with you. I just got in from the City of God group, so we have our dinner at the parish, but that's not till 5:30. So 4 or 5 hours will be fine if that works for you.
We won't go full Joe Rogan. We'll cap it off at 2 hours probably, because I've got to pick up a car and then have another conversation. So
yeah, whatever works for you.
Okay, Ron. Well, you emailed me about this. Now we're getting a couple of years after the Jordan Peterson wave. Now we're getting a whole bunch of books, including one that you've edited, and so we'll talk about some of those. Have you read many of the other books?
Yes, I've read most of them that have really, some were published late 2017. There was a whack of them came out 2018, and then one has just been published. I did an endorsement for one. It's a much more philosophical, thoughtful read of Pederson, and it just came out a week or 2 ago. And then our book will be coming out, and it's already almost off the press. It'll be out about a week.
Okay. Well, what was that one that you were just mentioning before, the thoughtful philosophical one? I didn't seem to find that one.
Yeah, so it's by Mark Champagne. He's teaches philosophy up here in the Fraser Valley at Kwantlen. It's called Myth, Meaning, and Anti-Fragile Individualism on the Ideas of Jordan Peterson. And so I wrote an endorsement for it, but what it does, it tries to look at some of the ideas that Peterson is grappling with, the legitimacy of those concerns, how he's often misunderstood. So the first part of the book is really trying to honestly understand what Peterson is trying to do at a deeper philosophical level. And then the latter part of the book evaluates both the contributions that Pederson makes, but perhaps the Achilles heels, the blind spots. So it's probably, of all the books, from a more secular philosophical perspective, I think one of the best books out thus far, reflecting on the not reacting in terms of sort of the loaded cannon of progressivism that just turns on him and fires, or sort of the naive hagiography of the right that just thinks he can, whatever he says is a Sinai oracle or something. So that the book by Mark from Lower Mainland, I know Mark fairly well, and he's attended some of the lectures I've done at UBC on Pederson. So he asked if I would first read it as it was in process, and then it's being published in England by Societas, it's called. But I think it's the best book out so far, just broadly speaking, from a thoughtful philosophical tradition, saying what's the good he's addressing in our post-Christendom, post-scientific world, not reacting one way or another, but judiciously reflecting on his ideas, and then saying, well, there's some good critical questions to be asked philosophically, not in an antagonistic or demeaning way, but just saying these are things, if we're going to move the discussion forward at a substantive level, these are questions we have to ask. And so it's a nice book. As I said, it just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's certainly a book worth having from a perspective that's non-religious, just approaching it philosophically.
Right.
That's all. It's a great contribution. It's a nice contribution.
I remember when Pederson was, again, I sort of mark the chapter of the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. We'll see if there's a second chapter or not, but it was sort of C16 to about June 2019, when his wife's, some of the drama around his wife's illness was sort of wrapping up. But that's, of course, when he attempted to withdraw from this medication and all of that happened. And that sort of bookended the wave that we saw. Okay, so I just found it on Amazon. I'll make sure to put a link to that in the notes too. I hadn't heard about that one yet. Well, that sounds very good and promising. A lot of the early books, I mean, I Vox Day's book, that was just, I mean, a lot of the early books seemed either just quick money grabs, quick write something on a hot topic and get it out there so you can sell some books. The biography that had, Dennis Prager did the intro. So, I mean, if Dennis Prager's, I'm not trying to, because I've got a variety of political people who watch the show. I'm not making a comment about Dennis Prager, but Dennis Prager's introduction basically locates the biography in a certain way. Okay, I'll say it that way because I haven't read the book. Reviews on the book were fairly. Did you read that book, Savage Messiah?
Yeah. It's of that right-wing persuasion. Both as you say, the Dennis Prager introduction, and then the book by Proser. I think it distort. I mean, the subtitle itself is, Saving Western Civilization, which is a bit inflated and pretentious. In that sense, I hardly think Pederson's going to say Western civilization, but the book slips into that hagiographical. Pederson's, the man for the moment. He's the Sir Galahad on the horse, and Proser tends to, I think, distort Pederson to serve right-wing interests, which then feeds into a narrative of the progressive left. That's really what Pederson is. He's an apologist for the right, but doing it in a sophisticated, not a crude way. So I think the Proser book does Pederson a terrible disservice in that sense. Whereas the Mark Champagne book is much more nuanced and subtle and reflective in a way the Proser book is not. And so our books tried to avoid that, sort of reducing Pederson to a right-wing agenda by selectively cherry picking from his writings, his ideas, and avoiding also the progressive left canon turning on him and firing without both sides misunderstand and misread him. And the nice thing about Champagne's book, and I think our book, which we've tried to also find a via media or a middle way, unlike Champagne's book, we've really tried to get into the implicit, if not the explicit, Christian thinking of Pederson and reflect on what that could mean through a series of, I think our book's also one of the first out that's a collected essays as well, not single authors. So it's coming at Pederson from a variety of spokes on the wheel that get to the core of his implicit Christianity, which is obviously explicit in some ways also. For example, when he does, various mythical reads of Genesis or Exodus, which finds a middle way in terms of approaching the Bible between a secularism which just ignores it and a literalism which distorts how you exegete the text. And so we have a series of essays, some of my former students and others, so probably half the book are former students, and others are from a broader swath who are interested in Pederson and want to contribute to a more in-depth understanding without either trashing him on the one hand or genuflecting him to the other.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just mention that a couple of the essays in your book are from there are a couple of essays from a couple of people that have been on my channel. Esther O'Reilly has been on my channel a number of times, and she's been pretty active in the Discord server and some of the community conversations I've had about Pederson. Alistair Roberts as well. Both of them have really fine essays in the book. It's maybe it's appropriate when so I was reading through the Goodreads reviews of Savage Messiah and looking at reading a variety of reviews. Pederson's relationship with the political, let's say the political aspect of the culture war is obviously part of his meteoric rise. Most of the things that he had been talking about for years, and you can go back on YouTube and find, early editions of Maps of Meaning at Harvard and a number of years. And he had been on Ontario Public Television quite regularly talking about a variety of issues. And so then to sort of cast him in primarily in a political frame. Now, he certainly had comments to make about Canadian and American politics. At least in terms of most of the people that I've been engaging, our interest hadn't been primarily his political focus, but more the personal impact, sometimes religious, sometimes pragmatic, that he was happening on a whole variety of individuals. It strikes me in thinking about the times and the politics, there isn't I don't think it isn't a coincidence that we saw Pederson and his moment arise at the same time as we saw Trump arise in the United States, Brexit, a number of these populist movements. And of course, as someone I grew up in the New York metropolitan area, and so Donald Trump was not a name that I was unfamiliar with in terms of a whole variety of things that he had been involved with. But what it seems to me that perhaps Trump and Peterson had in common was the negative was interest because of their negative impact that they had on one's political adversaries. For example, from the Christian Reformed Church in North America, probably 75% Republican voting as a denomination, not quite like the Bible Belt. I mean, more diverse than that. And of course, Trump's sexual ethic and habit with his tongue doesn't really rise to the standard of the book of James, let's say. Yeah, a lot of people love him because he whips their enemies. And I think, thinking about Peterson on the political stage, there's a fair amount of that too, because someone who perhaps in Canadian politics would have sort of a centrist, Canadian political posture, now suddenly to become the darling of a lot of folks on the political right seems like a strange transformation. But in that way, perhaps there's some similarity to the dynamics around Trump. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, first of all, one thing, Peterson is reacting to a lack of center in liberalism culturally. And liberalism has fragmented in two directions, which I think Peterson is reacting to, and we've discussed this before. One direction that all is perspective, and there is no right or wrong. There's just the hermeneutic of suspicion. And so we're all socialized beings, and nothing is neither right nor wrong. There's just seeing things that we think are relevant, and someone else is going to see it differently. So there's no foundation anymore. Or as Yeats say, the center cannot hold mere anarchy. The flip side of that, of course, has been the politically correct social justice warriors. That these are the boxes you check off if you're going to be a part of the tribe. And those particular interpretations tend to distort a more complex reality. And so, but they give certainty. So the one leads to uncertainty, relativism, perspectives. The other gives a false certainty, similar to fundamentalism, religion. I mean, it's just the social justice wars are just the secular version of Puritanism or fundamentalism in that sense. And so in that sense, Peterson's trying to find a middle way, in one sense, to recovering a more classic liberalism. That's saying, be wary, a little more intellectual humility is in order on the politically correct stuff, but be wary of just sheer ambiguity, uncertainty, relativism. And this is where the myths come in, because in a post-structuralist approach, there is no structure, there is no order, we just sort of make reality. And so myth, basically, in terms of that classical sense, says, no, there in fact is a structure, whether it's classical civilizational myths, or whether it's Hans Christian Andersen or Grimm's fairy tales or Walt Disney reworked myths in that sense, is that there is an order. And if we violate that order in our souls, in our psyches, in our lives, there are consequences to face. And I think a lot of people who are wary of those two wings of liberalism, the perspective post-structuralist, and then the ideological, politically correct, recognize that he is saying something to them in which they're longing for meaning, longing for purpose, but it's been denied. All the landmarks have been obliterated. That's what my article in the book is on, memoricide, myth and memoricide, and the lack of memory. And so where Peterson would share an affinity with elements of the right, although he would differ with certainly Trump, is that both of them appeal to a sense, there's certain standards I stand by, and liberalism has thinned out everything. Now, the content of that, I think Peterson would part paths with elements of the right and say, listen, the myths that I'm trying to articulate give you a perspective that don't fit into right or left.
Right.
In that sense, he transcends the tribalism of right and left. But usually those who take a position, either the social justice warriors or the conservative, both are positions that want to avoid perspectivalism or post-structuralism. They differ on the content of that, but the mindset is I'm right, you're wrong. The right and left, both elements of that have that mindset, a Manichaean mindset. They are at odds with the content of that. So I think Pederson, to see where he plays on the stage of these issues, he does fit into that position of saying there is order, there is structure, but I can't be equated with the politically correct social justice warriors and their notion of order, but I'm not exactly going to salute at the political right Trump stuff either.
Right.
So people who don't understand the ambiguities of the culture wars say, well, if he's not on the social justice stuff, which he raised questions about, then he must be on the Trumpian side and the alt-right, and he's not that either, you know. Sort of, he's willing to critique both sides, but he's often seen on the right in a way that perhaps he would be, well, I know he would be suspicious of also. Does that sort of make sense? Or
no,
what
it makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. I mean, what's fascinated me most about Pederson, of course, has been the response he elicited from not just young men. I mean, most of those who I've found in my experience to have been deeply impacted by him tended to be men between the ages of 25 and 45. So not college is just a little bit on the young side. Obviously, that's a generalization, and there are wings to that bell curve. But how do you think? In many ways, Pederson, in some ways, like others before him, reinvigorated myth to a community that was starving for it. Why did myth? Let's say it this way. Let's say applied myth, because obviously, through what we've been seeing, Harry Potter, Star Wars, there's been a fair amount of myth making in the movies, but Pederson, in a sense, invited people to apply myth more to their lives. I mean, why? Where was there a lack of? Has there been a lack of this in church, institutional religion, or other places that people have been looking for it? Do you think, which then elicited this response that there was to him?
Well, I mean, obviously a good question. We do have these big myths at one level in our culture, like the Harry Potter, like the Lord of the Rings, like the Star Wars, the various Walt Disney movies that come and go, that, redo variations of classical myths, either classical civilization, or, as I mentioned earlier, the Grimm's fairy tales, or the Hans Christian Andersen. And so I think, but what he has done, which I think you're right in saying, he's basically saying, okay, these are great myths in a post-structural age that transcend the tribalism of right and left, but how do they apply to each person specifically? And so 12 Rules for Life, or his work obviously as a psychologist and Maps of Meaning. He's very interested in not just the theoretical understanding. Interesting enough, I often find that, someone who was very trendy on the liberal left a few decades ago and did the rounds with myth, Joseph Campbell,
yeah,
or the men's movement, and particularly Robert Bly with his key mythic work, who's often seen on much more of that popular cultural liberal left. Pederson is doing exactly the same thing with myth, but he's seen as being on the right. And I think it has a lot to do with how he's applied his cultural analysis of myth and the contemporary relevance of it to a critique of the left in the way perhaps Campbell was not quite so explicit in doing, and Robert Bly, obvious, has not done in that way. So the question is like even the question, how do you interpret the Bible? Well, whose interpretation of myth, or which myth, and why? I deal with this in my chapter, Myth and Memoricide. okay, we're getting a renaissance. We have been over the last 200 years in some ways. Even the interest in First Nation spirituality is a critique of scientism and rationalism and getting back to the myths, the stories of the ancients, the elders. And of course, the Romantic tradition in the West has very much been about myth and story and what they say about the soul and the quest for meaning and the human journey. So the whole turn to myth and the application of myth is not new. And certainly the last 30, 40 years. And Joseph Campbell, I remember in the 60s, 70s, he was like a guru, did the tour of the universities and his multiple books on myths, even Alan Watts and some of his works on myth. And then Robert Bly, of course, in the men's movement in the 90s, his work on myth, his poetry on myth. But I think, as you mentioned, is Pederson has gone as a psychologist. His concern is practical as well as cultural and political. And he wants to say, so what's this mean at a sort of a personal devotional level for your own transformation, given the fact people are stuck in terms of identity issues, and they often feel paralyzed and impotent given a certain cultural ethos that tends to see the male as the problem, or the aggressive male, or the uber male, his argument is, there's something here, there's a mother lode that can be applied personally, not just, meta-narrative, even though that's there. So he's really trying, but I think what hooks him into the right is some of the issues he's confronted on the left. That's basically, so people miss his myth because of his politics in terms of the critiquing, what he sees as neo-Marxism or postmodernism or excessive feminism, ideological feminism. Obviously, he's not against the important role of women in leadership. It's what he sees as ideological feminism or ideological Marxism, or, power imbalances and how that played itself into certain politically correct things as well. So he's an ambiguous figure because he doesn't fit into the right, left, and what he's doing with myth is very interested in terms of application. And he comes at it from a psychologist. So Joseph Campbell didn't come from that. Robert Bly doesn't come from that. So he has a certain understanding of the human heart, human identity, human choices or lack of them, consequences. I don't know, does that sort of...
Yeah. Well, I think also, you're highlighting his coming at it as a psychologist. One of the things that was quite evident in, let's say, the question and answer sessions that he would do on YouTube, many of the questions he would receive were questions that you would expect a psychologist to get. And again, this is something that, Joseph Campbell or someone else likely wouldn't feel. They're looking for practical advice. And 12 Rules for Life is in some ways a very practical book. These rules he's telling you, this is what you should do, and this will make your life better. And it is very interesting, though. I wonder what it says about the times, or do you have any thoughts of what it says about the times in terms of the different reactions, let's say, to Joseph Campbell and to Jordan Peterson? Because, many people have looked at these two, both of them, a fair amount of Jungian ideas behind them, mythology. What do you think it says about the times in terms of the different responses to these two individuals?
Well, I think both Campbell and Bly and Pederson are responding to, on the one hand, a culture that's gone too far down the rationalist, technological, scientific direction. And they both hold up myth, not as the antidote, but as trying to balance off the limitations of reason and science as a means of answering the big human questions and the all too human journey in that sense. So in that sense, they share a certain affinity with myth as a means of addressing the human condition and its quest for meaning in that sense. Now, I think what you're saying is right, is that Pederson tends to be more prescriptive in a way that Campbell and Bly were not quite so obviously prescriptive. They would allow you to interpret it for yourself. They also were never as overtly political as Campbell and Bly, or if they were, they would be seen on the left
Right.
in that sense. So the question is whose version, who's in which myth and whose version. So with Pederson, you've got a fairly complex human being in that you can come in through the door of psychology, and what that means, you can come in his work of trying to balance science and myth. You can come in through the bigger cultural critique he's engaged in. You can come in through the political portal to get into sort of the cathedral of his thought. So depending what aspects of Pederson people are reacting to or responding to, they're going to spin off in one or another directions. The book that Mark and I have tried to do, Mark as an individual author, mine, we're trying to get beyond just the surface political stuff and say there's a deeper structure, either within Christian myth or world myths or modern myths, that underlay what he is doing, and there's reasons for it. The actual epiphenomena of that in the conflict of the culture wars, there's a deeper reason for it. So try and understand the roots, the foundation of which he's coming for, even if you have problems with some of the political way, or sometimes how he can come across, sometimes conflicts you with, rams and rutting season. And at times anyone would get tired of constantly being attacked. I think, anytime anyone's perpetually cornered, you either do the fight or flight sort of thing. And then, of course, just his own issues as a person, the family struggles, wife, his daughter, Michaela. I mean, they've had difficult family life. You wouldn't wish that on any. And some of the terrible things, I think it's appalling that, whether you agree with Pederson or not at various levels, the trip to Russia, the psychological difficulties, the addictions, some of the appalling things that are just trashing him in his moment of suffering when a person is down. That sort of cancel culture that, okay, you deserved what you're getting and your family deserves. It shows a boorishness in elements of the culture that if you don't like someone, just fire hose them rhetorically and demean them as a human being rather than being civil and respectful to them. So some of these responses to what the family is living through, I say, it says a lot about a certain temperament that will have, that does not deeply understand a human in their suffering and their painful dark nights of the soul. And whether, any of us agree or disagree with someone, when someone's down, as Shakespeare would say, the milk of human kindness should be exercised. And that's a much wiser way forward, human kindness and graciousness in the future. But again, it reflects elements of our broader culture, which are somewhat barbaric in terms of how we deal with difference.
Yeah. No, that was quite dramatic when Michaela's most recent video report on his situation came out. The response to that was, it was just horrendous. Even if, do on the other side, you had Rush Limbaugh. I've never listened to a single episode of his radio on my life, but it comes out that he has cancer and people want to pile on. And as a pastor, I certainly know this is what people think, but to bring this out into the public realm and enjoy somebody else's misfortune like this is an awfully ugly thing to do.
It is. I mean, obviously, you can agree with the extremism of Rush Limbaugh and the position he takes, but when someone is suffering, you, as much as far as possible, extend a hand of pastoral kindness, because as a human being, regardless of your ideology or intellect, you're a human who is suffering and is fragile. And anyone who is in that place knows you don't trash someone
Right.
in their moment when they're down. And it says a lot about people who would say and do things. I was also mentioning another book. I don't know if you've seen it. It's another fellow from Toronto. It's called Understanding Jordan Peterson, A Roadmap to the World's Most Controversial Academic by James Beverly. It's gone into a second edition.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got that one as a really handy reference on
Yes,
him. There's just a lot. I mean, which when I was, whenever I have to do a more formal presentation on Pederson, I pull that out, and because it nicely tracks, it has the dates, has links, has all of those things. It's a very, very helpful guide to, really that period of time that things happened very quickly. I mean, it is, one of the, I really enjoyed one of the chapters. One of the chapters in your book that really struck me was the comparison with Kierkegaard.
Yes.
I found that chapter fascinating. And whereas, as you and I spoke before, we spoke about Erasmus, we spoke about Luther. Kierkegaard has been an individual that has come up, the work of Kierkegaard has come up regularly in my sort of corner of the Jordan Peterson discussion. Many people have, Peterson sort of triggered some of these associations with Kierkegaard, and I didn't see it as clearly as when I read that chapter, and I thought, oh, that's another fascinating take on Peterson and this moment.
Yes, well, Stephen Dunning, who did that, he's a very dear friend of mine. He did his PhD on Charles Williams and Kierkegaard.
Oh.
And Stephen, he's lived in Abbotsford, taught at Trinity Western for many years. And so his PhD on, because Williams was a key figure in bringing Kierkegaard to England as a member of Oxford University Press. And it was actually Williams who 1945, because for many years C.S. Eliot and T.S. Eliot were at loggerheads. They caricatured one another. Eliot would not publish Lewis's stuff. The Inklings caricatured Eliot, and Williams thought this was like two silly little boys, scrapping. They were on the same agenda. The same mountain interested them. They were approaching it from different ways, and so 1945, because Oxford University Press had moved to Oxford at the time, Williams said to Lewis and Eliot, come on, let's have a dinner together. Let's end this silly dust up. You're on the same page. So he brought them together for a dinner. And as a result of that, they became the dearest of friends, T.S. Eliot and C.S. Lewis. They worked together with the new prayer book for the Church of England, the Coverdale edition, and updating the Psalter. And for the rest of their lives, they considered, until they both died in the 60s, the dearest of friends. But Charles Williams, so Stephen did his PhD on Williams and Kierkegaard. And I think where Peterson has affinity with Kierkegaard is Kierkegaard deeply internal, his agonized journey to have integrity, to have authenticity in the midst of a shallow Christianity, a culturally compromised Christianity. Obviously a brilliant thinker, an honest person, grappling. The same with Pederson. And it's understandable why the Kierkegaard-Peterson connection can be made. They both see themselves in the midst of a highly compromised culture that distorts integrity on the inner life, a deep internal struggle for integrity at a psychological, spiritual level. And so the affinities between, Kierkegaard and Pederson are, so obviously there. And Stephen has done a superb job, an A++ article in looking at why Kierkegaard and Pederson are almost brothers on the path, one a little later. Obviously, Kierkegaard's at a different period of time in which Christianity is a little more dominant religion. So his struggles in that sense are within a compromised Lutheranism, whereas Pederson's are much more in a secular age, but they're still grappling with that internal longing for integrity and identity and how you live your life in a meaningful level that is meant to work itself out practically in time. But yes, definitely there's just huge affinities.
I found that to be I mean, I enjoyed many of the chapters, but I found that connection to be of particular interest, especially how Pederson kicked up all kinds of conversations about Kierkegaard, but nobody I ever saw really make the connection between them like this chapter did. So I know some people who watch this will probably buy the book just for that chapter alone.
Because Stephen just knows, who did the chapter, he both appreciates Jordan Peterson, but he also knows Kierkegaard inside out, having done his PhD on Kierkegaard and Charles Williams. And so very few people are experts in both Kierkegaard and Peterson.
Yeah.
You know, and so Stephen has an expertise in both. And so his chapter reflects that, obviously, life journey with Kierkegaard and Williams, and now Kierkegaard and Jordan Peterson.
It's been, I mean, you, even before you and I spoke, you had done some video commentary on Pederson, and that's where I became aware of you. So that's been, I mean, Pederson has been on the public radar screen for 3.5 years or so, at least in a much larger way. Obviously had been in a smaller way within Canada. What has anything changed in your mind about him, or because over time, you know, we think we do a lot of our best thinking slowly. How has time impacted your thoughts on Pederson, his importance, or the times that really brought him to prominence?
Well, I think there's probably 3 phases of Pederson's life and writings that probably have to be reflected. One is the pre-216, where most people are unaware of that history, and at least to the book by the one on Savage Messiah by Jim Prosser, he gives you a little bit of that history for those who would have lived in Toronto at the time, and some of the TV programs, some of the taping, in which more or less Pederson was not known that well. But he was increasingly expanding in his influence and some of the issues he was confronting at U of T, and then his time in the States as well. These were the years when his thinking was emerging and slowly maturing. Most people will start with Pederson in 216, and this is when he takes front stage in a much more prominent way rather than a secondary or tertiary actor in the stage of culture. So that would be the first stage, when just trying to get it, Maps of Meaning had come out in the 90s. He was brought out here in the late 90s. He gave a lecture at Trinity Western, and he was still mostly known either in an academic context in which he was grappling with myth and psychology and counseling and raising questions about the limitations of a certain type of liberalism, shall I put it that way. And then the second phase would be the much more explicit, highly politicized Pederson from 216, in which he's been reviled or, supported in a much more intense, highly charged political environment, in which in some ways I don't think the best of Pederson has been able, or he's been able to be criticized a little more because sometimes of his public performances, going after people. And so the other side has come out of it, in which he's also been probably more prolific in the last few years through his publications, through his video appearances, through his public dialogues as well. Say in Canada, the 2 major issues would have been, on the one hand, the appreciative. I don't know if you saw the interview with Rex Murphy on Jordan Peterson.
I didn't watch it.
Yeah, it's you get a very vulnerable Pederson with someone who is one of our sort of leading, more conservative CBC commentators versus the other one with Wendy Mesley, which is a little more from the left and the right. So I would say the second phase is this last 2 or 3 years where you get him much more fighting for his life publicly in a much more larger forum. In that sense. The third phase we're entering into now is, on the one hand, a spate of commentaries coming out on him, which my book would be one, and Marx, and the Prosner, the Beverly. There's a whole range of other books. So we're hitting a phase of sort of commentary on him. That the question is, whose version of Peterson? So sort of the birds of appetite. Circling him. I think much hinges now in this next phase of his own life is can he slow down enough? Because this 216 forward, it's almost like he was on an accelerated public treadmill, in which inevitably you lose your way in that. It becomes a drug, an addiction, and you can only keep up that pace for so long. So it will be interesting in this next phase. Can he slow down enough to go deeper, not to become reactive, and to, in that sense, articulate a more thoughtful, less reactive perspective, which perhaps will give him greater longevity as an important cultural commentator. And it much hinges on, how he makes sense of the next couple of years, whether he'll just fade away as an epiphenomena whose day in the sun has come in. He says that we're spoken the speech on the stage of life, and that's as far as he can go because there's no to give personhood, or he will mature to a new level in which his philosophical, cultural, economic, religious, political thinking will take the next step. And I think much will hinge on the friendships around him, the people who can be with him, who can, give him a sense of, okay, be wary of this trail, say no to this invitation. It's sort of pointless. It's a bit of a dead end. And so I think this next few years will determine whether he ups the ante to a new level, or whether he just gets caught on he becomes the victim of his own popularity and gets hooked into that. And in that sense, he'll lose a depth of soul that could emerge. And I think if he has good people around him, I think because he has the resources to go deep. And I think that's part of Pederson that a lot miss. Yeah. And I think then he's managed to perhaps too quickly surf a cultural wave, which he's at times been able to surf well. At other times he's been caught in the undertow of it. And I think anybody who unexpectedly becomes a preeminent cultural actor, if they're not careful, they become the victim of their own success. Yeah. And then you get burnout, then you get reacting out of weariness, then undealt with inner psychological things begin to surface. And so I think the next phase will really hinge on if he can go to the places which he knows, but whether he can internalize and then live forth. And that will determine whether he stays on the stage or whether increasingly becomes marginalized and some new actress will come on the stage and take the cultural limelight in that sense. I hope for him and for others that in fact there is, and I think it's within him to do that, but it involves a sort of little inward searching in that sense and going to places which he knows are there. It's just the going to them and staying and being still and a listening, and then knowing where to say yes and no to invitations, because when you're popular, everyone wants a piece of you. And at a certain point, you have to be careful to say, no, I'm not going down that path, not theirs. I'll take maybe one invitation a month. I need my stillness and silence so I can go deep and then respond meaningfully. to the big questions of our time.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? I don't know what your thoughts would be.
I very much agree with you in terms of what I'd really like to see him do. I'd like to see him say no to more things. I'd like to see him pace. I thought what was called a book tour that he did of 100 and some odd cities and not too many more days. I thought, part of me, I think I suspect there were two factors. One of them was it seems to me, there have been many times that he has spoken of himself in terms of, he is a prophet who has a calling from God to save Western civilization. And so in that sense, the subtitle of the book, whether or not the author meant it as such, I sometimes would get the sense from Jordan that there's, his calling is nothing short of that. And as a pastor, there's something that we talk about in the clergy business, which is a Messiah complex. And it is not a good thing, because as a Christian, we have one Messiah, and I'm not him. And so I think part of what I suspect drove Jordan was a genuine desire to help individuals. And on that wave, again, from what I had seen, it was a truly incredible and phenomenal moment where many, many, many people were helped at a very practical level. He helped make their lives better. And in our current context, hearing that from individuals is so powerful. You get the sense that if I stop, it's almost, at the end of the movie Schindler's List, he's going through, I could have saved one more, I could have saved one more. So you've got that driving him. The other thing that I feared was now suddenly he's in the grips of the, what shall we call it, of the media industrial complex, that Jordan Peterson is a money machine. And every time he steps on stage, Jordan's making money, but his handlers are making money. The publishers are making money. Television would love to get him on on and on and on and on. And those people are going to keep throwing opportunities at you. And it's one thing to say no as an academic who's, you're living the middle class wage and maybe you got a little extra money coming from books, but now serious money is coming after you. And so you've got these two engines. One is thousands and thousands of people. You're hearing from these people one way or another that you are saving their life, and you have made dramatic change in their life. And very quickly, within the span of a couple of years, you're a multimillionaire. You have a best-selling book. Every time, it's not only the book sales, it's the stage appearances, it's the after stage VIP picture, all of that. That is powerful, powerful stuff. And it not only, and just speaking as a pastor, I frankly wouldn't want anyone under my care to face such temptation.
Yeah, it's a heady brew. Both the Messianic Dilemma, and particularly when you think what you're doing, legitimately or illegitimately so, is assisting people at very fragmented and difficult places at your life. There's conscience kicks in and says, well, I'm grateful I can do this if it's helping these people. The dilemma always is, often our motives are mixed between good and then, oh, I'm helping them, but they're really bloating me. So it becomes a tricky game. And people like Carl, I mean, Pederson would know all this, as
Yes.
someone who knows Carl Jung, knows myth, knows that the good can often be distorted to serve the questionable, the worst case, vice and destruction. And often certain people legitimately are motivated to do the good, but then the motives that creep in are more about them, and they're using other people to serve their other ends. And anyone who's at that level has to always be checking their motives at the door, which isn't easy. That's why you need good friends. And then, as you say, there's the lure. The lure of money is always one. And so, yeah, and this is why myth is so important, I think, is because all the great myths say we're complex beings. And there is the shadow, there is the dark, or in Christian terms, there is the sinful side, there is the old Adam, there is the old Eve. That's not going to go away magically, or snake oil or silver bullets, not going to take it away. And so one always has to be very careful that, I mean, Satan comes as an angel of light. It's easy to pick up darkness if it's horns and tails and fascism and Nazism, but when it comes clothed in light and service, that's when it becomes very deceptive. And you need the wisdom of a Solomon to say, I better be careful here. And popularity, of course, is quite a drug that can be quite heady and addictive. And so this is why I think the next phase of his life has to be one of perhaps recognizing the shadow at a more internalized level, knowing where to say no. We're doing the City of God, as I mentioned earlier, and Augustine makes it clear there are these two tendencies within all of us, cupiditas and caritas. And in that sense, he anticipates any great myth and is a part of a great mythic classical way. And so that level of flattering ourselves and being the Messiah or solving the problems, that's a very dangerous path to take. And I think if he had good pastoral friends, they would say, let's get off this treadmill. Let's slow down. Let's say no. People are just going to burn you out, and then they'll bring some new figure on the stage. Everyone's in that sense dispensable to the media or to the money moguls. In that sense, they use you, abuse you, then you're gone. We bring in someone else to strut their role on the stage, and then we burn them out, and we pay them well, and then we bring on someone else. And so this disposable nature of anyone who we greet on the stage. And so this is why I think the next phase of his life is, can he read the broader invitations in his own heart on a deeper way and respond from a more centered, what T.S. Eliot talks about, the still place in the moving world in the four quartets. So I think you're right. Those two temptations, I mean, Jesus faced them in the desert too, that this as we enter Lenten season.
This is Sunday's text. I've always got Sunday's text, rolling around in my head.
Yeah, well, this is Shrove Tuesday, so we indulge ourselves with pancakes tonight, and then we start Lent tomorrow, or Ash Wednesday. So Lent is a good time to reflect on the inner motivations, the complex ones, and then how they work themselves out practically in the material, ecclesial, public, intellectual, cultural, political world. So I think, as I said, I think the next act in the play of his life will hinge on what he does with the last intense 3 years that he's lived through. I know our book has just tried to get into those deeper parts of Pederson that if he internalizes what he knows, which is always, it's one thing to cognitively know things. It's another thing to have thoroughly internalized through soul and heart in the midst of the culture clashes, what we intuitively and mythically know. And I think that will be his challenge, which will then determine. And then, of course, he's got just the personal family issues as well, which you don't want to say it's a gift. No one would want to say it's a gift, but it has forced him to slow down. And the one element of that painful suffering thing is that obviously there's deeper places you go to when something so close to the bone as your daughter, your wife, yourself is suffering at that level. You can't keep accepting the newest invitation and running, because that can be a form of escapism, an addiction, a diversion from the deeper issues. I'm now front stage on actor. Everyone's, booing or cheering, but at least I'm stimulated by external stimuli of the crowd. When you go to families which are suffering, you're in one sense a nobody. You're just in the midst of quietly suffering and trying to make sense of that, where the crowds are not there anymore. Yeah. Those are not easy places to be in. You're not on the stage anymore. Yeah. And so
I fear, one of the interesting things when you look at church history, we've talked a little bit about Augustine today. I mean, Augustine didn't live in the world of Instagram or YouTube or Twitter. Augustine on Twitter could have been very interesting. But it's, and yeah, I agree with you completely in that, we don't know ourselves until we've been tested, and few of us have been tested by the kinds of things that Jordan has been tested by. And that's on many levels. He, by all appearances, he's had a very close, intimate relationship with his wife. His wife traveled with him on tour constantly. She very serious brush with death, with cancer. I don't know the state of her health right now. His daughter, clearly, as he wrote about quite a bit in 12 Rules for Life, significant medical issues her entire life. And as those of us who have children know, it's dealing with our health is one thing. Watching our children suffer is a whole different thing. And, everything he's been through, I certainly hope he can take some time, and, and I certainly also hope that medically he can take time to really heal, not just his body, but his soul. And as we also know, crises like these can deepen one and afford one new perspectives and new strength to engage temptations and other challenges too. And that's really what I hope for him, now from this chapter since summer of 2019, that he will be able to engage, with his already considerable gifts and talents and experience now, the questions that he's obviously been deeply interested in his whole life. He can engage these questions at new levels. And this can be something that through patient revelation and wise cultivation can actually continue to bless the world with. That's certainly my hope.
Yeah, and suffering can be a real sacrament if understood properly, in terms of transformation, in terms of deepening, in terms of wisdom and discernment. I mean, no one, unless there's something quite wrong with you, makes a virtue of suffering. But when it comes our way, people either can react to it and become angry or bitter, or they can see it as a means of deeper wisdom. And much hinges on what we do with suffering and pain and tragedy in life will determine what we become as people. It's like William Blake's, the songs of innocence, where people are born in a context where, generally the sun shines, the sky is blue, the world is generally good. Then the next phase of life is the songs of experience, where people hit suffering, they hit tragedy, they hit betrayal, they hit disappointments. And a person can go in one direction towards cynicism and anger and bitterness. You can't trust the world, you can't trust others. Or that can be transformed into wisdom and insight and sensitivity to others who suffer, And so empathy. And so the very gift of suffering is the means of deeper empathy for others who suffer. And so one would hope that in some ways, in terms of what Jordan Peterson and his family are living through, is it could lead to a greater wisdom, deeper quietness, deeper insight. And because, his journey was obviously for many years in psychology and counseling. He's concerned with the human soul, initially his own soul, his own struggle, and out of that, his suffering, concern with other people's souls. It's just, as I mentioned earlier, any good thing can get twisted when you're, offered the possibility to be on front stage. You get paid well, and so the good gift that he has been given in terms of his temperament and his gifts, I think in this, what I mentioned is the second phase, it can be a means of a deeper internalized understanding that he as a shepherd of souls could offer a greater listening and healing to others if he takes that next step into the songs of, for Blake, then you move into the songs of wisdom and the songs of love, the four levels of the human journey. And often suffering is the portal that you have to go through again and again to reach that internalized center in which you're there for people. So I think the next stage, as I mentioned, is much hinges on this very intense few years that he's lived through. I think he's probably wise enough, and his friends are probably honest enough to say, you don't want to return to that.
Yeah.
Hopefully something's been learned, but what next?
Yeah.
And that takes time. That's a mystery. Once you see I'm leaving this behind, it's one thing to say when I'm, leaving behind, but one is never too sure what you're going towards. And that's a faith journey. It's a mystery, but he does know now where he shouldn't be. Yeah. The question of where should he be on the journey. And I think that will hinge on good people who are willing to be honest and not either slip into trashing him as a human being, which doesn't help, or hagiography, just, Pederson's the most one, so whatever he does is de facto infallible, he's the well, that's not helpful. That just feeds into a problem. The other is honest friends who tell the truth. Yeah. And that to the degree he hears, listens, responds to, internalizing and live forth, I think you'll have a lot to offer if that next phase of his maturation takes place, and only time will reveal that to us.
Yeah. Well, good. Any other things you wanted to touch on today, Ron? This has been wonderful.
No.
Okay. I will. So the book that you edited is coming out. I saw that it's on Amazon. It's on pre-order.
Hello?
Can you hear me? Oh, did we get disconnected?
Fading in and out a bit, yeah.
Okay. So I'll re-ask the question. Any other things you wanted to touch on today before we wrap up?
Well, I would just say I would encourage people to get the book if possible. Welcome reviews on Amazon. I hope it makes a contribution to Pederson studies while avoiding the extremes of, trashing and hagiography. I think it's the first book through a variety of authors that are trying to look at what he's doing with Christianity in a more substantive way. But I'll leave that up to reviewers to decide in that sense. So, but welcome, purchase, and obviously reviews, because reviews help us understand what we've missed, what we've contributed, and then the next step in understanding Pederson and where he has been, but where he might be. We await the next step of the journey.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ron, for your
welcome.
time. And I will post this tomorrow, and I will have links to all of the books that we talked about. And yeah, we'll see in the comments section what people have to say about our advice for Jordan.
Well, many thanks. Have a good evening.
Okay, take care, Ron.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.